ambitions of these two specific leaders sparked the deadliest conflict in human history, and how the ashes of their devastating war laid the direct groundwork for the Cold War. To really grasp the sheer magnitude of this bloodbath between 1941 and 1945, you just have to look at this staggering number: 30 million. Out of the roughly 70 million lives lost during the entirety of the Second World War, nearly 30 million of those were extinguished on this single front. It's almost hard to wrap your head around, right? It was a theater of war defined by unimaginable destruction, extreme ideological fanaticism, and absolute, total warfare. And this actually leaves us with a massive historical paradox. On one hand, the Soviet Union emerged as the ultimate military victor. They took Berlin and utterly destroyed the Third Reich. But on the other hand, the demographic and economic strain of losing tens of millions of citizens created these deep structural flaws that absolutely contributed to their downfall decades later. Meanwhile, a completely devastated Germany somehow rebuilds itself into a European economic powerhouse in less than half a century. To really understand this paradox, we have to look closely at the individuals who are actually steering this catastrophic war. Which brings us right to the climax of the war. This wasn't just a clash of massive armies. It was a deeply personal and ideological clash of leaders. From the dictators sitting at the very top, all the way down to their most trusted field marshals, the fate of the entire world essentially rested on the shoulders of a select few individuals. Their decisions literally sent millions to their deaths. A perfect example of this is the Battle of Stalingrad. Raging from late 1942 into early 1943, we see this brutal test of wills between the Axis and Soviet commanders. This was, without a doubt, a definitive turning point. On the Axis side, you have General Friedrich Paulus. He was this meticulous staff officer who got thrust into a grueling urban meat grinder, all because of Hitler's obsessive desire to cut the Volga River's supply line. Facing him on the Soviet side was Georgy Zhukov, a brilliant, totally uncompromising tactician who masterminded a massive encirclement strategy. You know, Zhukov's own life, rising from peasant origins all the way to the absolute pinnacle of the Red Army, really perfectly mirrored the brutal resilience of the Soviet state itself. Well, the outcome at Stalingrad was nothing short of catastrophic for the Axis. Despite some incredibly fierce combat, the German Sixth Army was completely encircled and just entirely destroyed. And here's the wild part. Hitler had actually just promoted Paulus to field marshal with the explicit, unspoken expectation that he would fight to the death or take his own life. But he didn't. Paulus surrendered instead. The Axis ended up losing a massive chunk of their strength on the Eastern Front. It was a complete disaster for Germany, effectively meaning a military victory in the East was now totally impossible. But of course, the conflict escalated even further at Kursk in the summer of 1943 with Operation Citadel. Germany pitted its absolute top tactical minds, guys like Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and General Hermann Hoff, against a deeply prepared Soviet defense led once again by Zhukov, alongside General Nikolai Vatutin. Manstein, who was widely considered Germany's most gifted strategist, was absolutely desperate to regain the offensive initiative. He threw literally everything he had at the Soviet lines to try and avenge that massive disaster at Stalingrad. But the Soviet commanders weren't caught off guard this time. And here is where it gets really fascinating. Thanks to the famous Lucy spy ring operating out of Switzerland, Zhukov was actually reading the German plans almost as soon as they were drafted. Armed with this incredibly precise intelligence, the Red Army built these remarkably deep defensive lines. They were able to systematically absorb the German assault and completely neutralize the Wehrmacht's technological advantage in heavy armor. This incredibly tense standoff ultimately culminated at Prokhorovka. Here, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps and the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army basically collided in the largest, most devastating display of mechanized warfare in human history. Imagine hundreds of these massive steel leviathans engaging at point-blank range on the open steppes. The air was literally choked with thick black smoke and the deafening screech of twisting metal, with tanks firing on each other from just mere meters away. The sheer visceral scale of destruction on those burning plains broke Germany's offensive capacity permanently. Smelling blood in the water, the Red Army launched a rapid series of massive, overwhelming offensives, which they personally championed as Stalin's 10 blows. For the Soviet dictator, this was a moment of ultimate personal vindication. Throughout 1944, they drove the Germans back thousands of kilometers. By the summer, they had liberated Belarus and pushed all the way to the borders of pre-war Poland. The momentum was just this unstoppable tide sweeping from east to west.
and this relentless advance completely shattered the German lines. During the Vistula-Oder offensive in early 1945, Soviet forces were isolating entire German army groups. They pushed forward with such speed and such ferocity that they brought their forces right to the very doorstep of the German capital, eventually halting a mere 60 kilometers from Berlin to regroup for the final strike.
Now, with the military reality on the ground drastically shifting in favor of the Soviets, the leaders of the Allied powers met in the Crimea at the Yalta Conference. They were there to determine the fate of the post-war world. Keep in mind, the guns hadn't even stopped firing yet, but the battle lines for the next half-century were already being quietly drawn right at this very table. The Big Three gathered at Yalta to effectively carve up Europe. You've got Franklin Delano Roosevelt, representing an America with massive economic might, but whose own health was physically declining. You have Winston Churchill, representing an exhausted British Empire. And then there's Joseph Stalin, whose Red Army now occupied vast stretches of the European continent. Because of that massive military footprint, the power dynamics in that room had fundamentally changed. So while Britain was economically drained and Roosevelt was ailing, he would actually pass away just weeks later, Stalin held the absolute strongest hand. And his advantage wasn't just military either. Aided by Soviet spies like the Cambridge Five in the UK and Alger Hiss in the US, who had secretly infiltrated the Western delegations, Stalin often knew exactly what his allies were going to propose before they even sat down. Talk about an upper hand. These pivotal negotiations resulted in a deeply divided continent. They agreed on the division and demilitarization of Germany. They laid the foundation for the United Nations. But crucially, they yielded to the reality of Soviet influence over Eastern Europe. And this, right here, effectively laid the direct groundwork for the two-power global struggle that would totally dominate the next 50 years. The post-war realities set in incredibly fast. That alliance of convenience between the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union, it rapidly dissolved the second their mutual enemy was defeated, revealing these stark, completely incompatible ideological divides. Winston Churchill's famous words at a speech in Fulton in 1946 perfectly captured this grim new reality. He declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. Europe was now strictly divided into a Western bloc supported by the US and an Eastern Soviet-aligned sphere controlled tightly from Moscow. The hot war had ended, for sure, but the Cold War had officially begun. What do you think about this war? What impact did it have on the world? Let's